Before we proceed, I would like to let you know that this evening's lecture and discussion will be live streamed on LKI's YouTube channel. As such, what is said today is available to everyone beyond this room. We will begin with the introductory remarks by Professor Nayani Melagoda.
Excellencies, Professor Ramesh Thakur, Mr. Jayantha Dhanapala, and our distinguished panelists, members of the Board of Management, Lakshman Kadiragami Institute, members of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to all of you. It is indeed my pleasure to make the introductory remarks at this timely lecture on nuclear policy and prospects for disarmament in the New World Order, organized jointly by the Lakshman Kadiragami Institute and the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. I would like to introduce today's proceedings with a reflection on the broader political context of the New World Order and how nuclear tensions affect this setup. Before outlining how Sri Lanka might navigate nuclear issues in the current global political conditions. The current international political context is one where nationalism of different degrees of variation appears politically influential. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Brexit, President Donald Trump's It's America First policy, and the electoral gains made by the successful right-wing nationalist party, Alternative for Germany, we can see a rise in populist rhetoric that appeals to nationalist sentiment. This rise has yielded leaders and policies that are testing traditional checks and balances, both in Western democracies as well as in non-Western countries. There are, of course, differences between these emerging nationalisms. For example, the nationalism in some Western democracies appears to be driven by a public desire to withdraw from foreign engagement and intervention. This is evident in Brexit and America First policy, which reflect concerns over immigration and the cost of continued military engagement abroad. By contrast, leaders in emerging economies and regional powers appears to be encouraging nationalist sentiment to help expand those countries' influence and power overseas. How does the rise of nationalism affect the issues of nuclear disarmament and more broadly the prospects for a peaceful world order? At first glance, the outlook seems pessimistic. We need only to look at the interaction on Twitter between the leaders of North Korea and the United States to come to the view that current rise in nationalism is accelerating nuclear tensions. While interested observers have long feared a sudden, irrational resort to war by leaders of authoritarian states such as North Korea, they now also fear similar behavior from the populist leaders of some democratic nuclear weapon states. This is because, for three reasons. First, the first figures in those governments seems to keen on undermining checks and balances. Second, there are multiple nationalist voices in governments increasing the risk of rogue acts. And third, there is a pressure from populist political formations outside government to consider using nuclear weapons. However, it is also worth examining whether the current context of rising nationalism offers any possibilities for nuclear non-proliferation. As mentioned earlier, the nationalism now apparent in Western democracies is focused on withdrawing from foreign engagement and intervention. Therefore, there is arguably less of an appetite among voters for possible nuclear intervention in other countries. Meanwhile, in emerging economies, there is a nationalist sentiment to expand their country's influence abroad. The framework that they have established will require stable peace. Whether it is China's Belt and Road Initiative or India's Neighborhood First policy, All of these initiatives would be derailed by nuclear tensions, nuclear escalation. Civil society should work to identify these convergent sentiments and interests in favor of nuclear non-proliferation and use them to advocate anti-nuclear policies. What should Sri Lanka's role be in this context? As a small non-nuclear state, Sri Lanka cannot afford the prospect of nuclear conflict in the Indian Ocean region. Therefore, like other small states, it should focus on advocating for a rules-based order with regard to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. In doing so, Sri Lanka should also seek to reaffirm the principles of non-alignment, which guided its pro-peace advocacy for many decades. As a non-aligned country, Sri Lanka has taken proactive steps towards supporting global peace, including deploying its military and police as UN peacekeeping forces since 1960s. Sri Lanka's efforts to advocate for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament is within this broader pro-peace activism inspired by the principles of non-alignment. It is instructive to note that in this regard, that earlier normative initiatives in Sri Lanka's foreign policy, the 1971 Indian Ocean Zone of Peace Declaration, actually drew inspiration from nuclear weapons-free zones proposals. Therefore, there are historical links between Sri Lanka's broader non-aligned foreign policy and anti-nuclear stances. Considering that Sri Lanka has already voted to adopt the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it should also sign and ratify the treaty. Sri Lanka could take inspirations from New Zealand, which implemented a nuclear weapons-free zone in the South Pacific, despite being in a formal defense alliance with the United States. Of course, there is much more to be said in analyzing how smaller countries like Sri Lanka, as well as larger nuclear weapon states, can cooperate on nuclear non-proliferation and non-disarmament. To proceed with this analysis, we are very fortunate to have with us today a distinguished expert, Professor Ramesh Thakur. If I could provide a very brief introduction to Professor Ramesh Thakur, he is the current director of the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament at the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University. He is also a co-convener of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. In his career, Professor Thakur has served as an advisor to the Australian and New Zealand governments on arms control, disarmament, and international security issues. He was Vice Rector and Senior Vice Rector of the United Nations University and Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations from 1998 to 2007. Professor Thakur is the author or editor of 50 books, 400 articles, and book chapters. He has written regularly for several newspapers around the world and serves on the international advisory boards of institutes in Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. Professor Thakur is the principal author of The Responsibility to Protect R2P 2001, as well as the principal writer of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's second reform report in 2002. Professor Thakur, I have the pleasure to inviting you to the podium to deliver your lecture. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Dinisha Pandiratne, LKI Board of Management members, my fellow panelists, my APLN colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a humbling experience to have the honor to address you on this very critical topic at a particularly critical juncture in world affairs, especially in relation to nuclear policy. Just to begin, we have this map, which is a SIPRI map, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, from a year ago, which graphically displays the world of nuclear weapons. Although it's from a year ago, the situation would not have changed that much since then. I will come back to some of the details of this later on, but it's worth noting the overwhelming dominance of the United States and Russia, who between them account for something like 94% of the world's stockpile of nuclear weapons. And that's important to remember, because if our concern is with nuclear weapons, then 94% of our attention should be directed to these two countries. The original NPT, signed in 1968, in force in 1970, indefinitely extended in 1995 under the wise counsel and chairmanship of Ambassador Jayantha Dhanapala, has now been not replaced by, but added to by the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in simple terms, the Nuclear Ban Treaty. The original NPT, as we know, had three legs: peaceful uses of nuclear energy, the facilitation of the transfer of technology and materials, but under guaranteed promises of nuclear non-proliferation, and it had the famous Article 6 commitment by those who had nuclear weapons to engage in good faith negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons. That said, there was a pronounced imbalance between non-proliferation and disarmament in the NPT. The non-proliferation commitment was immediate, legally binding, verifiable, and in the end, even enforceable. And a whole series of supplementary agreements and treaties sprang up around the original NPT, particularly as various shortcomings and deficiencies were discovered. And as you know, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has functioned as the nuclear watchdog, while its primary purpose remains to facilitate the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, the peaceful applications of nuclear energy. By contrast, nuclear disarmament was vague, of indefinite time commitment, non-enforceable, non-verifiable, and not surprisingly, has not been accomplished. One of the reasons for the failure on the nuclear disarmament front is, in my view, a de facto double instrumentalization of the NPT by the 5 nuclear weapon states. Remember, the NPT recognizes 5 countries as nuclear weapon states: United States, Soviet Union / Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. And this double instrumentalization is, on the one hand, they use the NPT to legitimize the indefinite possession of nuclear weapons by themselves, insisting that all that the NPT Article 6 requires is for them to affirm every once in a while, yes, we are committed to nuclear abolition eventually when the circumstances are right, on a step-by-step basis, without jeopardizing international security, and so on and so forth. And on the other, they use the NPT because of its binding obligations on the non-proliferation side as the principal management tool to enforce the non-proliferation obligations on all the others. Helped by the fact that the only enforcement agency that we have in the world today is the United Nations, meaning the Security Council, whose 5 permanent members, of course, are the 5 nuclear weapon states. So the N5, the NPT illicit nuclear weapon states, equals the P5. But it's worth remembering that the two are different. They happen to coincide. But too many people, I think, use P5 when they mean N5. The result of this double instrumentalization was that a treaty that for the majority of the international community had been conceived of as a prohibition regime was de facto transformed into a non-proliferation regime, and only a non-proliferation regime. In other words, from the point of view of those who were granted a temporary and conditional exemption from the nuclear abolition requirements, deterrence nuclear deterrence trumped nuclear disarmament obligations. That is to say, their national security calculations overrode the requirements of international security. By contrast, the ban treaty, adopted last year in July, opened for signature in September in the UN General Assembly, and with, I think, 54 signatories by now, including 4 ratifications. Regrettably, the list does not include Sri Lanka as of yet, for reasons that remain a mystery to me. For the international community, the ban treaty reverses the relationship between deterrence and disarmament. Disarmament, in the view of the majority of the international community, including approximately 2/3 membership of the NPT itself, disarmament is more important than deterrence. And that is because, in their view, international security considerations trump national security, and also humanity overrides security. And I'll go through this in a bit more detail later on as well. What does the treaty do? There's this comprehensive list of prohibitions, the most comprehensive with regard to nuclear weapons that we have in any treaty. And indeed, it aggregates many other prohibitions from a range of other treaties, including the NPT, including the CTBT, etc. It bans the possession of nuclear weapons. No ambiguity, unlike the NPT. No country is permitted to possess nuclear weapons. It bans testing of nuclear weapons. So it reinforces the CTBT prohibition. It bans the stationing of nuclear weapons, something that is permitted under the NPT. As we know, NPT non-nuclear weapon states, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Turkey, permit the stationing of NATO nuclear weapons on their territory. The ban treaty prohibits even that. It bans the use of nuclear weapons, and it bans the threat of use of nuclear weapons. To ban the use and the threat of use is to prohibit nuclear deterrence, because nuclear deterrence depends centrally on possession and then the threat of use and the implied use of nuclear weapons as the primary role of nuclear weapons and the justification for nuclear weapons as a means to keeping nuclear peace. Again, some of these issues I will come back to. What next then for the ban treaty? Well, the first task will be its entry into force. Unlike the CTBT, and learning from the CTBT experience, it's a fairly simple procedure for entry into force. It will enter into force 90 days after 50 states have ratified the ban treaty. As I said, at the moment there are 4 states, the ratifications will come. I think, well, I've seen no evidence that countries that voted, 122 countries voted to adopt it on 7th July last year. It should be fairly straightforward to get 50 ratifications. That said, I think the normative impact will be much stronger once that number has climbed to approximately 100. So it's a psychological threshold, because then you have a majority of states of the international community that have signed and ratified the treaty, and that increases that pressure. In the meantime, the NPT has entered into its current review cycle, which is important because the review conference will be 2020, which will be 50 years since the treaty's entry into force. And of course, the review conference is supported by between 3 to 4, depending on what people feel is necessary, preparatory committee or PrepCom meetings, the second of which will be this year. And over April, May, we're going to have the PrepCom, but also the UN high-level conference on disarmament, which also the nuclear armed states have been reluctant to endorse and be part of. As we approach 50th anniversary, there's one fact that is quite startling when you think of it, but most people don't think of it, which is worth remembering. And that is that in 50 years of the NPT's existence, not a single nuclear warhead has been dismantled under the authority of the NPT. We did from my center a study whereby we looked at the agreed action items from the last successful NPT review conference, which was in 2010. Remember, 3 years ago, the review conference failed to produce an agreed outcome document. This study we published in 2015, and it looked at all the action items. Even though the action agenda items numbers was actually smaller than this, we took some of the individual action items subcategories as separate items. And if you look at that, and as you go from left to right, you'll see that I assume you can read it even from the back. The categories that were fully implemented or that demonstrated significant progress were categories of peaceful uses and non-proliferation. In that order, the categories where there was least progress and maximum non-implementation relate to nuclear disarmament. Remember, only those that possess nuclear weapons can disarm. So it's worth turning that argument around. The countries that had the nuclear weapons have been the most delinquent in implementing the agreed outcomes from the NPT review conference. As we know, the NPT review conference takes a lowest common denominator approach. You agree to an outcome or action item that everyone signs on to, including the nuclear weapon states. A more ambitious set of targets against which we benchmarked our report is the recommendations of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And there you see the failure to achieve any advances on nuclear disarmament is even more dramatic, more starkly graphic. That's not the only reason why we had the ban treaty. Since the NPT's entry into force, another 4 countries have acquired nuclear weapons. In chronological order, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Once you list the countries, you realize that some of them, if not all of them, are in regions of deep-rooted conflict that have experienced wars frequently, that are prone to volatility, and where conflict can break out again. In addition, not all of them have reliable, robust command and control systems, and there are worries about unauthorized use, rogue launches, infiltration into terrorists, and so on and so forth. In other words, there is a greater risk of either deliberate or unintended use of nuclear weapons with the spread to more countries in these unstable, prone to violence regions. To go back to the first map, but in a slightly different context, you can see that there has been a dramatic fall in the total global stockpiles of nuclear weapons since the height of the Cold War. 64,500 at peak, down to below 15,000 today. But you can also see that even after the NPT enters into force, global stockpiles rose quite substantially, despite the Article 6 commitment to disarm. And what you can see is that when I put it like this, the existence of nuclear weapons in the other 7 countries is barely visible on that graph. Once again, it's Russia and the United States that dominate that graph. So that's another way of documenting the failure on the disarmament front. By the beginning of last year, at the latest, arms control efforts had stalled over experiencing reverses, to the point where a Russian expert, Alexei Arbatov, warned that arms control may be near its own end of history and about to unravel. Nuclear risks, on the other hand, were generally felt as being on the rise, climbing, multiplying. And there was a growing awareness that the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons by design or accident would be catastrophic. And so the net conclusion that perhaps the NPT was no longer fit for purpose, not that it had not served a very critically important purpose over all these years to date. Rather, that perhaps its normative potential or capacity had been exhausted. Because by the start of last year, the non-proliferation side had been pretty much universalized to all countries other than countries that possess the bomb. Being sworn in as President of the United States, and a series of tweets where he demonstrated quite convincingly his complete ignorance of nuclear issues and his fondness for the bomb and his erratic and unpredictable propensity to issue threats against all and sundry, all combined to heighten fears of a nuclear war. By the way, I've been reliably informed that there is no truth to the rumor that the Pentagon has increased the nuclear launch codes to more than 140 characters. So President Trump cannot tweet the launch. This is reflected in the updated doomsday clock, the famous doomsday clock, announced just a few days ago. We now in 2018 are assessed to be at 2 minutes to midnight. The closest the clock has been to midnight, the last time it was at this level was in 1953. The date coincides with the acquisition of the hydrogen bomb by the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. The furthest we have been is 17 minutes with the end of the Cold War in 1991. Last year it was moved to 2.5 minutes. This year it is 2 minutes to midnight. Now, of course, this doomsday clock now takes into account not just nuclear threats, but also environmental threats. Nonetheless, the primary explanation for this is the Trump administration coming into office and the series of things that follow from that. Why is disarmament important? Well, I don't think you can actually achieve progress or hold progress on non-proliferation without disarmament. It is both a logical truth and an empirical truth. If nuclear weapons did not exist, they could not proliferate. Conversely, because they do exist, they will proliferate. In other words, the very existence of nuclear weapons is a sufficient guarantee of proliferation, or conversely, nuclear disarmament is a necessary condition of nuclear non-proliferation. Therefore, our choice is, if we want nuclear non-proliferation, we must prepare actively for nuclear disarmament, or alternatively, if we fail on disarmament, we must be prepared for a proliferation cascade and a nuclear weapons use, if not by design, then by rogue launch, system error, or accident. The case for nuclear disarmament can be made both under a security paradigm and under a humanitarian paradigm. The security paradigm argument was best and most eloquently and elegantly expressed in the report of the Canberra Commission, of which Jayantha was a member way back in 1996 as well. It had a 3-stage proposition. As long as any country has nuclear weapons, others will want them. As long as nuclear weapons exist, they will be used again someday, if not by design, then inadvertently, through accident, rogue launch, or system malfunction. And any use of nuclear weapons could be catastrophic for the whole world. That has now been updated by the humanitarian imperatives movement, which rose in particular during 2013 and 14. Again, 3 propositions, but different. No country individually, nor the international system collectively has the capacity, physical, administrative, scientific to cope with the humanitarian impacts of nuclear war. Second, it is in the interest of the very survival of humanity that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. Third, the only guarantee of non-use is the total, irreversible, and verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons. In other words, the net conclusion of the three humanitarian principles propositions is that the collective interest of the international community in disarmament overrides the individual interest of the possessor states in national security, because the latter puts the world's very survival at risk. There's been a lot of criticism of the ban treaty and the humanitarian things. The central proposition of the criticism is that the ban treaty will not make any difference, because only those who have had the bomb can get rid of them, and all the countries with the bomb refused to attend the conference, voted against convening the conference, and have said explicitly that they will not be signing it and do not consider themselves bound by it. I think that's an intentional misleading characterization of the intended purpose of the ban treaty. It is intended to be primarily normative in its impact, not operational. And the norms it seeks to reaffirm, consolidate, and strengthen are firstly non-proliferation, secondly non-testing, both of which it shares with the NPT, but beyond that, non-use, a reaffirmation of the normative boundary between conventional weapons. The original NPT promise was that nuclear weapons themselves are a problem. They are qualitatively, the quantitative escalation in destructive capacity is so great that the bomb is qualitatively different from every other type of weaponry that we have had. It is the most indiscriminately inhumane weapon ever invented, and therefore the bomb itself must be eliminated. But North Korea must not have even one. Iran must not have even one. These are rogue regimes. They are wild, unpredictable, erratic. The quality of their nuclear decision making cannot be trusted. Well, think of Mr. Trump. As Hillary Clinton famously asked, would you trust his fingers on the nuclear button? His finger is on 7,000 nuclear buttons. North Korea's at most on 60. There is no control over approximately 1,000 weapons that President Trump can fire. He issues the order, not launching is illegal under the American system. Then you have Article 6 of the NPT, which is very rarely actually read. The Article 6 obligation is each of the parties to the treaty. It's not just those who have the bomb. Has a responsibility to engage in good faith negotiations to take effective measures to eliminate nuclear weapons at an early date. And therefore, given the fact that there were no other negotiations underway on nuclear arms control, that this was a UN mandated multilateral conference held in New York in March and then again in June, July, it seems to me that the countries that convened the conference and voted for the ban treaty were implementing their responsibility under Article 6 of the NPT. And it's hard for me to see, on a common sense reading of this clause, how those that refused to take part were not in breach of the Article 6 obligation. Not just the nuclear weapon states, all others. On top of this, we have the advisory opinion of the World Court in 1996. Three of which conclusions are quite crucial to this argument. First, they said any use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the principles of international law, and in particular, the principles of international humanitarian law. Second, they said they could not conclude definitively that the use of nuclear weapons would be legal even if the very survival of a state was under threat. And third, they said under Article 6, countries have an obligation not just to engage in good faith negotiations, but to bring these negotiations to an early close to achieve nuclear disarmament. Against this, countries argue for deterrence. But there are three sets of problems with the nuclear deterrence argument. Firstly, the historical record is actually quite skeptical about the utility of nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union expanded its territorial and political empire in Eastern Europe largely between 1945 and 1949, years in which the Americans had a monopoly of the atomic weapons. So, nuclear weapons by the United States and non-possession by the Soviet Union did not deter the Soviet Union from expanding across Eastern Europe. And as we know, the Soviet Union imploded after, although not because of achieving strategic parity. We have no known record of a country contemplating aggression, but deterred from implementing that contemplation because of the possession of nuclear weapons on the other side. We do have historical examples, Americans in Vietnam, Soviet Union in Afghanistan, of nuclear weapon countries being defeated on the battlefield by non-nuclear weapon countries and being unable to convert their nuclear monopoly vis-a-vis the adversary into any battlefield military utility. We have the example of Argentina invading the Falkland Islands in 1981 or 82, whenever it was, even though everyone knew at the time that the United Kingdom had nuclear weapons. And I can go on and on a series of things. The basic point is the historical record does not demonstrate any practical utility. And I argue, a bit like the emperor with no clothes, is it time to call out the nuclear emperor for being naked? Maybe the reason they haven't been used against since 1945 is that they are fundamentally unusable. Why restrict the monopoly to Israel in the Middle East? Give it to Iran, give it to Saudi Arabia, give it to Turkey, give it to Egypt. The more the merrier, or the more peaceful. So either they work or they don't. If they do work, why is proliferation a problem? It should be the solution. Any region that is volatile and prone to conflict and violence, proliferate nuclear weapons. So whichever way you look at it, deterrence does not stand up. And this is an argument that we have to keep making again and again and again. If you think it through, it doesn't actually make much sense. So conclusions. The collective revulsion of the international community against the bomb found a double expression in the NPT, both in the prohibition of nuclear proliferation and in the call for nuclear disarmament. That I should take one N out in that NNP, obviously. But a temporary exemption was granted to the nuclear weapon states based on a conditional acceptance of deterrence, because deterrence was seen as the means to preserving the nuclear peace, and we didn't want to destabilize that. But with the end of the Cold War, the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, the fact that these are in more volatile regions, the lack of robust and reliable command and control systems, all these have altered the perception of the relative risks and benefits of deterrence. And the changing perceptions means that the very possibility of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons use in the future means that their possession by anyone today has become unacceptable. And that's what underlies the ban treaty. And therefore, deterrence is seen by most countries today as a problem, not a solution vis-a-vis nuclear peace. The solution instead lies in nuclear disarmament. Now, of course, it is true that only those who have the bomb can cap them, reduce their role and prominence and visibility, and in the end, eliminate them. But the non-possessor states can close the legal gap on prohibition. Because the nuclear weapon states instrumentalized the NPT, effectively they denied the legal obligation under Article 6, and therefore they opened up a legal gap on prohibition. So the international community said, all right, we will close that gap. Plus the fact that the non-NPT nuclear armed states don't have the legal obligation of Article 6 in any case, whereas the ban treaty hopefully would extend to all of them. So what the non-possessor states can do is to stigmatize the very possession of nuclear weapons and to delegitimize the possession, the threat of use, and any possible use of nuclear weapons. That is what the ban treaty seeks to do as a means of increasing the normative, moral, international community pressure on countries that have nuclear weapons to begin the process of getting rid of them safely, securely, and irreversibly, but now and sooner rather than later and in the indefinite future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Thakur, for your very illuminating lecture and presentation. We will now move on to our panel discussion, moderated by Mr. Jayantha Dhanapala. Mr. Dhanapala is a former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, in which post he served from 1998 to 2003, and a former ambassador of Sri Lanka to the US and to the United Nations in Geneva. He served as the 11th president of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs for 10 years from 2007 to 2017. He was also the director of the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and he also served as the president of the 1995 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review and Extension Conference, which was a landmark event in disarmament history. May I now hand the floor over to Mr. Dhanapala.
Thank you, Balaram. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have just heard Professor Ramesh Thakur giving you a masterly and comprehensive description of the current situation with regard to nuclear weapons. And as he quite rightly pointed out, Sri Lanka has been a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for a long time, but we have still not signed the nuclear ban treaty, and I hope that will be remedied in the near future. We move to an interesting panel discussion with panelists from a variety of countries, both nuclear and non-nuclear, and people who have had practical experience in multilateral diplomacy dealing with the question of nuclear weapons. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak. We have Mr. Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who was India's former ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and who joined the diplomatic service in 1976, served in the Indian mission in Brussels, Dhaka, Geneva, and Islamabad in different capacities, and was also deputy chief of mission in Washington. In Delhi, he served as Director Disarmament and set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division in the Foreign Ministry, which he had for 8 years as Joint Secretary. Subsequently, he has served as Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and as Ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. In September 2013, he was appointed Special Envoy of the Prime Minister for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Issues. He held this position till May 2014 when he retired from government. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. I will introduce the other speakers in due course, but Rakesh Sood will begin his contribution to the panel discussion with a 5-minute presentation. Rakesh.
Thank you, sir. At the outset, let me first of all thank LKI and APLN for this opportunity to be here this afternoon and address this wonderful audience. I think Ramesh has set out the different elements of the existing legal regime, the possibility of the ban convention and the kind of potential it it has for the future. What I will try and do is since I see so many young people in the audience, I will try and be provocative and try and push you to think outside your comfort zone. And I hope through that we can perhaps generate a good discussion. Now, there is no getting away from the fundamental truth that the only certain way to eliminate nuclear risk is through global nuclear disarmament. That is a self-evident axiom. The question is which road to take. Because unless you identify the problem correctly, you won't find the solution. I think let's look at two facts. The only time nuclear weapons were used was when only one country had nuclear weapons. They've never been used since, after 1945. So, does that mean, as Ramesh in his final comments where he said that if proliferation is so good, if more countries having nuclear weapons maintains peace, then why should we not have more is better kind of thing? Not necessarily. But at the same time, the reverse is equally true. Does one more country having nuclear weapons spell apocalypse? Not necessarily either. So therefore, we have to have a more balanced, nuanced view in terms of what is it that constitutes or enhances real nuclear risk. Second fact, again, Ramesh put out those slides and he said that at the height, the world consisted of, or the countries with nuclear weapons had a total of more than 65,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Today, it's about 15,000, so about less than 1/4. So, by normal thinking, it would mean that we should feel more secure. But do we feel more secure about the fact that there are 1/4 as many nuclear weapons today and that the number has been steadily declining from the time that they reached their peak in 1970s? Not really, because the risks associated with nuclear weapons have actually increased, even though the actual number of nuclear weapons has come down. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that therefore many of the hypotheses that we have had about nuclear arms control, nuclear non-proliferation, etc., many of these hypotheses are actually worth questioning in today's time and age. Because one fundamental thing that we need to remember is that nuclear weapons today are not what, in terms of science and technology, are not as phenomenal as it was in 1940s and 50s and 60s. Today, it is a 70-year-old technology. So in that sense, it is much simpler to be able to figure out, and with a reasonable degree for a country to master the technology to be able to produce nuclear weapons. And it is in that today's context that we need to be able to look at what nuclear weapons imply and what is the kind of threat. So let's come back to, if today the risks of nuclear use are greater, then why is it? There are four reasons. The first is the planned use or premeditated use between two nuclear adversaries. The second is an inadvertent escalation because one crosses a red line which is somewhat blurred, doesn't really know that this is a trigger where the other country will respond using nuclear weapons. A third is a miscalculation because today, with growing developments in cyber science and cyber technology, the risk of interference with nuclear command and control has actually gone up. And that kind of interference could lead another country to presume and mispresume and miscalculate, ending up with a nuclear response. And fourth is terrorists who have indicated that they will not shy away from using weapons of mass destruction if they could get their hands or develop these capabilities. So with these rising threats, how do you deal with are the existing instruments that we have had, that we have relied on so far, how can they serve us? First of all, the important thing is that since 1945, we have not seen the use of nuclear weapons. So what is it that has kept nuclear peace? Is it deterrence? Is it absolute wisdom on the part of the leaders of United States and Soviet Union or others? Or is it just good fortune? I mean, you just bumbled along and continued and reached up to 2018. It's impossible to actually figure out the correct answer, because then you are moving into the realm of the counterfactual. But I think what is important is that the non-proliferation treaty, in a sense, does it mean that we should also do away with existing arms control? Not really. It doesn't, just as it doesn't mean that more is merrier, and it doesn't mean that one more is apocalypse. It doesn't mean that numbers up and down is necessarily the best barometer of nuclear security. It also doesn't mean that the NPT has been a failure, not at all. The only thing I would say is that the NPT has reached the limits of its success. It can't take us any further because of the mismatch in obligations, which was so well brought out by Ramesh, that the nuclear weapon states do not see the obligation to disarm as their responsibility. They see that, they, on the contrary, see it as that they are legally recognized nuclear weapon states. So they interpret it differently in terms of looking at the NPT as their right to possess nuclear weapons rather than as the responsibility to get rid of nuclear weapons. Finally, therefore, if we have to maintain the taboo on nuclear weapons that has lasted more than 70 years, then we need to look at different approaches. The traditional arms control of counting numbers and saying, okay, you have 15,000 and I have 15,000 won't work, because it's a different world. There are countries with wide asymmetries in the number of weapons they have, at the levels of technology they have, and so on. So therefore, we have to move to an instrument where we end up, if we need to prolong the taboo, to delegitimize nuclear weapons by limiting the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategies, moving towards de-alerting of nuclear weapons, and moving towards globalizing a no first use, namely every country undertakes not to be the first to use nuclear weapons. Therefore, the longer the taboo continues, the greater the delegitimization and the greater the prospects for achieving global nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. Our next speaker in the panel is Sadia Tasneem, who is a lecturer in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies in Kadizam University, Islamabad. She has conducted extensive research on various aspects of strategic stability, nuclear learning, and the implications of knowledge diffusion as a core member of the program on strategic stability evaluation. Previously, she worked as a senior research scholar at the Institute for Strategic Studies, Research and Analysis at the National Defense University, as a research associate at the International Islamic University, and as a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at the National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. It is indeed a great privilege for me to share this panel with such esteemed scholars and practitioners. Also,
Sorry.
wonderful to be here at the LKI. Thanks to APLN and LKI for giving me this opportunity. I'm so glad to see so many young faces here taking interest in this very important discussion. I'll try to make my remarks as accessible to you as possible. But let me say at the outset that there will be a bit of overlap with what has already been said, but maybe with a slightly different perspective. So what I'll do is I'll quickly recap major trends in the nuclear policies of the nuclear armed states, as well as key political, social and technological trends at the global landscape. Given all these factors can and will play an instrumental role in terms of defining the challenges and opportunities for global disarmament. In the last few minutes, I'll specifically focus on what the contemporary trends and policies mean for future of disarmament in Pakistan. So looking at disarmament from the standpoint of nuclear armed states and their subsequent nuclear policies, the trends, the contemporary trends do not appear favorable. All we see is a heightened emphasis on nuclear buildup, a loud rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons, and increasing potential of escalation in different theaters of conflict. This month's cover page of the Time magazine titled "Making America Nuclear Again" says it all. The most alarming part of the contemporary trends is President Trump's willingness to break the existing nuclear norms that the US has not only followed throughout the past 2 decades, but also played an active part in persuading others to do so. The Nuclear Posture Review and President Trump's orders relating preparations to resume testing in the Nevada desert are also alarming. If the US pursues the policies that the Trump administration is signaling, this would have severe implications for disarmament efforts worldwide. Other nuclear armed states, including Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and the DPRK, that are already either modernizing their existing arsenals or building new weapons, will feel encouraged to tread the same path. South Asia in this context is already fairly active with India's development and testing of ICBMs, that is intercontinental ballistic missile defense systems, and a nuclear triad, and Pakistan toying with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, short and medium range ballistic missiles, and sea-based capabilities. Disarmament negotiations involving nuclear armed states are at a near halt. In Pakistan and India, the space for disarmament debate is also shrinking with the US-led initiatives of the Obama administration losing their fanfare. Global Zero movement is a case in point. The Pakistan chapter of the Global Zero have been closed last month, and I suppose it's the same with India. This itself speaks of the momentous challenges for transnational movements and civil society-led initiatives for disarmament in South Asia. This does not mean that, and I'm not trying to imply that the space for civil society-led discourse cannot be created. However, it would need innovative approaches to make any headway. Going back to the global landscape, all hope is not lost. Although the nuclear armed states present a dismal picture, however, we are also witnessing parallel developments taking place in the UN and elsewhere in the form of the entry into force of the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty that Professor Ramesh Thakur has talked about in detail, growing civil society activism against nuclear weapons led by the International Campaign for Abolishing Nuclear Weapons, and conferring of the Nobel Peace Prize to ICANN in recognition of its efforts for the Prohibition Treaty. In other words, the contemporary global trends are clearly contradictory. We are standing at the crossroads, and it is hard to determine at this stage where the world will eventually head to. These contradictory trends are further accentuated by strong indications of a world in transition, where new power centers are emerging, whereas old are trying hard to cling to what they consider their birthright. These trends and power transitions manifest themselves in many ways and forms and will eventually affect the prospects for disarmament. Our generation, for instance, has witnessed massive technological shifts in a relatively short period of time. Along with other things, the technological developments in the military domain have created possibilities of undermining the utility of nuclear weapons. Nuclear arsenals are now more vulnerable to increasingly advanced cyber and space technologies, missile defense systems, and long-range conventional strike and autonomous systems. Likewise, military robots, unmanned aerial vehicles, and other sophisticated systems capable of precision targeting are going to reduce the relevance of nuclear weapons as military instruments. Modern technologies are in many ways altering the nature of future threats and likely responses. However, this reality has to seep into the collective conscience of nuclear armed states. Therefore, this point needs emphasis in any conversation on nuclear disarmament. That does not mean that these new systems are risk-free or morally tenable. However, these new technologies will probably generate more support for nuclear disarmament in future. At the larger political level, we are seeing a reversal of the gain secured by social and political movements over the past century. We are frequently hearing terms like death of liberal order, collapse of cosmopolitanism, a retreat to nationalism. All terms make us feel that we are re-entering into the pre-World War I era. This day and age has been aptly characterized by the scholar philosopher Pankaj Mishra as an age of anger, but it is also in many ways an age of disillusionment and an age of massive intellectual confusion. This disillusionment and confusion creates opportunities as well as challenges. Disillusionment creates appetite for direction, confusion creates appetite for clarity. If timely recognized and seized, such moments during periods of transition can be steered toward greater stability. But if left unattended, they could be a recipe for disaster. For instance, the disillusionment with the NPT-based nuclear order has resulted in bringing many non-nuclear weapon states to bring to fore the historic Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty. Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty also revealed how power to frame the conversation and shape the discourses has interestingly diffused from the traditional power centers to those who are willing to claim it, notwithstanding their military prowess or financial status. It remains to be seen whether these states continue to assert their moral ascendancy and authority to shape the conversation on disarmament in future. If these states remain steadfast, disarmament will make a headway. In this case, role of rising powers can also become instrumental. For instance, if China or India join the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty and take a leadership role in the disarmament debate, which doesn't appear likely in the near future though, it will fundamentally alter the fate of disarmament. One of my Indian colleagues and friend Dr. Manpreet Sethi has proposed a more practical idea of India and China formalizing their no first use commitment through a bilateral arrangement. Such small steps can also go a long way in persuading other nuclear armed states to follow suit. But back to the global trends, the contemporary transition period is also marked by new forms and manifestations of power. For instance, the emancipatory power that comes from global connectivity is unprecedented today. It has created enormous opportunities for creating transnational movements. However, it again remains to be seen how the younger generation and particularly the pro-disarmament activists use these new tools to achieve their objectives. Now, I'll very quickly talk a little bit about what these trends mean for Pakistan. As I mentioned earlier, the world is in a state of flux, clearly resulting in strategic uncertainty, causing a lot of anxiety. Under these circumstances, states will interpret these emerging trends that I've talked about based on their own worldview and preferences. Pakistan, being a relatively small nuclear armed country and a financially weak state, is facing considerably high degree of uncertainty in the face of technological innovations and power shifts. In the absence of alternative means of survival like modern technology, high quality education or economic independence, as a viable state, nuclear weapons have acquired much more value in Pakistan than these weapons deserve. From Pakistan's standpoint, nuclear weapons not only provide the country cheap deterrent vis-a-vis India as well as others, but also keep Pakistan relevant at the global stage, irrespective of how negative or positive that relevance is. Under such conditions, can the contemporary approaches to disarmament work to persuade Pakistan to consider disarmament? A short answer is no, not in the near future. In the past, we have seen Pakistan's reluctance to agree to negotiations on the FMCT, on other incremental steps like relating disarmament like CTBT. Pakistan has already put the ball in India's court. Coming to the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, notwithstanding the official position of Pakistan on rejecting the treaty, there is a deeper intellectual problem regarding this approach that comes from the challenge of reconciling two opposing worldviews. The humanitarian and normative approach of the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty is rooted in cosmopolitanism. But the societies like Pakistan that are not even familiar with such a worldview require a massive overhaul of the societal nomenclature. It means changing how people view the world. That is a massive task to fulfill, particularly under the contemporary circumstances, where some of those states who championed and popularized cosmopolitanism are now relinquishing it. Also, another major challenge with Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty is that it seeks to delegitimize the use of nuclear weapons by hardening the distinction between conventional and nuclear weapons. Clearly, it doesn't say anything about preventing conventional wars. States like Pakistan, where nuclear weapons are already considered distinct and valued for what Pakistan perceives as their ability to not only prevent nuclear attack, but also prevent full-scale conventional war, are not going to be impressed by this notion. After all, those who consider nuclear weapons weapons of peace are unlikely to get affected by the humanitarian perspective of the ban treaty. Pakistan looks at nuclear weapons from a utilitarian perspective as opposed to the normative perspective advocated by the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty. In the existing milieu, nuclear weapons prohibition treaty will have only modest impact on Pakistan. So what can help create a constituency for disarmament in Pakistan? A couple of things that Professor Ramesh Thakur said in closer to the end of his presentation with regard to deterrence are very important in this regard. Although delegitimizing nuclear deterrence is helpful, what could be more effective to persuade nuclear armed states to disarm is the need to expose the fallacies of deterrence discourse. Therefore, I propose the existing discourse on disarmament needs to broaden its scope, along with other notions like accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons and contemplating the possibility of breakdown of nuclear deterrence. There should also be dispassionate analysis of the impacts of nuclear deterrence on the quality of security in situations where deterrence apparently holds. So the case against nuclear weapons should focus both on the elements of risks and redundancy. For instance, it is important to focus on how nuclear weapons have, over the years, created conducive conditions for indirect wars, resulting in massive loss of human life. According to some estimates, the losses during these indirect wars have been far greater for humanity than the full-scale wars. Nuclear deterrence, therefore, is an overrated idea that needs to be treated that way. Such an approach would put the deterrence optimists championing the idea of peace and stability through nuclear weapons on the defensive. But for any meaningful progress on disarmament in Pakistan, the conversation has to spread beyond the existing caucus of less than half a dozen people. Such conversation can be popularized by persuading the policy-making elite of the intrinsic value disarmament conversation carries in terms of broadening policy options in case of crisis between India and Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Li Bin from the People's Republic of China. He's the director of the Arms Control Program at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He is a senior fellow working jointly in the Nuclear Policy Program and the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a professor of international relations at Tsinghua University. He previously directed the Arms Control Division at the Institute of Applied Physics and Computational Mathematics, where he also served as executive director of the Program for Science and National Security Studies. A physicist and an expert on nuclear disarmament, his research focuses on China's nuclear and arms control policy and the US-Chinese nuclear relations. Coming from China, may I wish you a happy new year.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm so honored to join the panel discussion here. I arrived in your country several days ago, so I had time to see your beautiful country and to talk to your friendly people. I understand that the Sri Lankan people so much cherish the peace and the stability in your country. You do not want to be threatened by military conflict. You do not want to be threatened by nuclear weapons. I fully understand that. So for that reason, I believe that we should minimize the roles of nuclear weapons in the world and in the region. For my country and for India, our position is that we will not use nuclear weapons if we are attacked with nuclear weapons. For Pakistan, the position is that we will not use nuclear weapons if we have other resort. For the United States, the Obama administration, the position is that we will not use nuclear weapons if our vital interest is destroyed. But the Trump administration is very different. The Trump administration's position is that the United States will use nuclear weapons to protect its dominant influence in the world and in different regions. So that is totally different ideas than last resort or vital interest or no first use. Think about this. When I have discussions with my colleagues, here, when I talk, I have some influence. When my colleagues talk, they have some influence. I want to stop their influence. I want to dominate the discussion. So I use nuclear weapons to protect my influence. How could I do that? Right? The Trump administration has a solution. The reason you cannot do it is because your nuclear bomb is too big. If you have a mini nuclear bomb, you could shoot your colleagues, or at least you could threaten to shoot your colleagues. Then you could stop their influence and you dominate the discussion. Right? This is the philosophy of the new nuclear policy review of the United States. But the problem is that your colleagues could retaliate you with counter-nuclear strike. Then nobody would survive. So that is the loophole of the philosophy of the new nuclear policy review of the United States. So I very much want to tell the decision makers in my country, don't believe that. That would not work. Nuclear weapons may be last resort, maybe a tool to protect your country from nuclear threat. Nuclear weapons cannot do much beyond that. I want to tell that to my neighbors, India and Pakistan. Don't believe that. I want to tell American people and American security experts, the nuclear policy review is bad. The philosophy is bad. I want to tell the North Korean decision makers, nuclear weapons are not so useful. It's a good idea for them, to stop and to give up their nuclear weapon program. So if we believe that nuclear weapons are not so useful, then we have better chance to go zero. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker for the evening before we go on to question time is Ambassador HMGS Palihakara, former Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka and former Permanent Representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations. He has had a distinguished diplomatic career in the Foreign Service of Sri Lanka. His last diplomatic assignment was Sri Lanka's Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York, 2008 to 2009. He was also chairman of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters in 2012 and the Sri Lanka ambassador to the UN Conference on Disarmament, Geneva. His most recent civil service appointment was as governor of the Northern Province from 2015 to 2016. Earlier in his career, he was also a member of the UN Secretary General's Intergovernmental Panel that updated the Comprehensive Study on Nuclear Weapons 1990 to 1991. Pali, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I can be very brief, and it is comforting to speak after my Chinese colleague because he assured us that whether it is a small bomb or a big bomb, nobody will survive. So this brings me to my first point, which is that the problem with the nuclear weapons affecting whether a small country like us or a big country is that not only its hardware part of the bomb technology, but also the software part, the doctrine or the theory, the so-called deterrence, theory of deterrence. It was not as if the bomb was invented to fit an existing doctrine. It was that the bomb was invented and the doctrine was developed to fit the bomb. When we discovered, not we, the people who produced it, when they discovered it is not a weapon of war, but one of mass destruction. Now, this, I think Ramesh pointed out it very correctly, this lies at the heart of the problem. That deterrence also fuels proliferation, not only new nuclear weapon states, but also new nuclear weapons. So that is the crux of the problem. Now, is it good to resolve that problem by progressively delegitimizing nuclear weapons' role in security? Yes, but the problem is that the existing nuclear countries want to lock in their status and delegitimize everybody else's ones. It's the classic case of I am ready to negotiate your one and my one I will keep. So that is the issue, the first issue. And this brings me to my second point, which is that the ban treaty, obviously a very good measure, and it's some greenery seen after a long disarmament drought. But as Ramesh pointed out, there are drawbacks in the treaty, which is that not a single nuclear weapon state is a party to it, whether a new nuclear or rather old nuclear weapon state, new nuclear weapon state, NPT nuclear weapon state or non-NPT one, Asian nuclear weapon or the Atlantic one. They are not parties. Not only that, they are allies, the people covered, the countries covered by their nuclear umbrellas are not a party. So it's not the ideal framework or the model to start negotiating framework, but it is a very good normative enterprise, a norm setter, even a pressure point. So we all must support it despite its drawback. And therefore, I also hope that smaller countries like us, Sri Lanka should support it. And it is not clear why our support to the resolution has not been converted into support or signing the treaty, especially in our own region. People will wonder why should we be talking about nuclear disarmament, we have other priorities. But the problem is that South Asian region is a nuclearized region and we don't have a single forum to discuss whether there are civil nuclear threats or military nuclear threats. In South Asia, there is no forum, no dialogue taking place. And of course, in South Asia, we have this very good tradition of not discussing uncomfortable things. It may be a part of that. But nevertheless, in the nuclear area, well, we will not know when it becomes uncomfortable because a nuclear emergency can occur anytime. And radiological emergency does not have to result from a nuclear exchange. It can result from a terrorist attack on one of the hundreds of nuclear reactors in our neighborhood. And people downstream are not even aware of how fast it will happen. They are only aware of tsunami, etc. That is why it is important that there is awareness creation and organizations like yours, Ramesh, ours, APLN and others can sensitize people to it in addition to, of course, the governments. So, this brings me to my last point, that is the DPRK, the North Korean and the Iranian situations. Now, I would see this also as part of the doctrinal problem. What Mr. Kim Jong Un saying today is as a ruler of his country or president of his country is no different to what Mr. Trump is saying. Of course, I am not referring to buttons. They were talking about I have a bigger button and other one was saying, okay, I have a smaller button. Not that. But Mr. Kim Jong-un is saying that nuclear deterrence, my nuclear arsenal is the only guarantee against the American aggression. Now, you may find fault with Mr. Jong's other policies, but on this one, you can't blame him because he is saying basically what Israel was saying when it acquired the bomb against hostile Arab neighbors and Iran. And then we have Iran. Iran is a situation where a country willingly, well, not willingly, country was persuaded to give up the nuclear option by multilateral efforts. A number of countries, including the US. And then you have a situation where that country is now being about to be punished for signing that agreement and going back to sanction regime, perhaps by the Trump administration action. Now, in that situation, Mr. Kim Jong-un is a winner. He has very cleverly maneuvered his position into a situation where door is opening for negotiation. So, in other words, if you get the bomb and negotiate, you are better off. If you give it up before getting the bomb, you are worse off. So that's the situation as one can see. So this is the current nuclear order or disorder, whatever we may like to call it. But I would like to end by thanking APLN and Ramesh to bring out all these dimensions and commentaries on this issue, which is absolutely necessary to sensitize people and create awareness so that the people can discuss these issues, especially in our own region. Really, a public discussion of these issues have not taken place. Thank you.
Thank you, Pali. You heard now from the panelists, and it is time for audience participation. We have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. Would you kindly raise your hand, introduce yourself when I call upon you to speak, and then indicate to which panelist your question is directed, or whether you want Professor Ramesh Thakur, the keynote speaker, to answer the question. So the floor is now open for questions. Yes, you, sir.
Good evening, panelists. I am General Veeraman from Sri Lanka Army. My opinion is that now, starting from those days, the Cold War era, a lot of people came out from their homes to the street and went against this nuclear issue during a Cold War period. But nowadays, we can't see much on this because the voters select leaders of various countries, especially these nuclear countries. I don't know why it is not happening, because is it because of the poor media coverage or written literature or notes, or they are afraid to come out and discuss this issue, as Palyakara sir said, and even other thing, I presume that people are not much concerned about this issue, because they have lot more things to discuss in the open forums. So what is your opinion, sir?
Is your question directed at any one particular panelist?
Professor Ramesh.
Ramesh. The absence of any demonstrations as in the past against nuclear weapons, I think.
I think more than apathy, it's a symptom of complacency and ignorance. I think we are in danger of sleepwalking into a nuclear disaster. The point to remember about sleepwalking is those who are walking in the sleep are not aware of the fact at the time. Once you start talking to people, they generally tend to be shocked and sobered when confronted with the reality and the facts. Most people think, most people seem to think that this was a problem of the Cold War and disappeared with the end of the Cold War. Whereas in fact, it's a legacy from the Cold War that continues. We face only two really existential dangers today. Climate change and nuclear weapons. Those who deny the reality of climate change are derided as denialists, except in countries like Australia and the United States, where they're known as the government. Those who deny the reality of nuclear threats are praised as realists, when in fact all the threats exist and the bomb could kill us a lot sooner and a lot faster. And the fact that we have managed to keep nuclear peace for 7 decades owes much more to good luck than to sound management. And it is akin to someone who jumps off the 40th story of a building, and as he passes the 30th floor, he's heard to mutter, well, so far, so good.
The next question. Yes, Chandra.
Any one of you could answer this. Isn't it time for ICJ to meet again? Because things have changed. For instance, Russia has broken down into Belarusia. Countries are what happens if the nuclear country breaks up and they use against each other, or specifically Belarusians have the nuclear some of those installations there. The second is with cybercrime and cyber being a fun thing to do, to go and spoil something. I think there is a need for some kind of international order specifically on this, because people seem to be robbing banks to having fun making changes. So I really think an international order, is it time for ICJ to review the development since 1996 on these kinds of things and make some pronouncements?
There are two problems with that approach, much as I sympathize with it. The first one is that the ICJ can deliver a verdict but has no enforcement power. Any enforcement of ICJ ruling comes back to the Security Council. Well, guess what? The 5 permanent members are the 5 nuclear weapon states. The second problem is that and this is a problem that's very familiar to any student of Indian politics. You cannot go to the judiciary for a legal resolution of a dispute that is fundamentally political strategic rather than legal. And the third dissent to your suggestion also would be, I suppose, I would add to it, is in any case that has been overtaken by the Ban Treaty. Because the Ban Treaty now affirms on behalf of the entire international community through the United Nations that possession of nuclear weapons is illegal. You don't need to go to the World Court to get that verdict anymore.
Ambassador Navaratna Raja, you have a question?
This is a rather philosophical.
Speak to the mic, please.
Speak.
Philosophical question. Addressed to Professor Thakur. The father of the American nuclear bomb, Oppenheimer, realized that this was a technology, a human grasping of a cosmic technology, cosmic forces. And he named it as, he got inspiration from Bhagavad Gita and said that it's a... Now, this cosmic technology, can this be put back into the genie of the bottle, as the American nuclear scientists found when they started this with as a race against the Nazi Germany producing the bomb. But after the Nazi Germany was defeated, and then before the first Los Alamos bomb explosion, they wanted to stop it, but they couldn't. So can this be stopped? Can this technology be put back into the genie? That is the question that I want to ask.
It's to me?
Well, it's a cosmic question, it's a philosophical question.
Rakesh. I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle, because you can't reverse history. Because that's the whole advantage. I mean, you are driving forward, but when you look in the rear view mirror, it helps you to drive forward. So you can learn from history, but ultimately you have to move things forward. And it reminds me, I mean, you can wake up everybody. You can wake up somebody who's sleeping. You can wake up somebody who's even sleepwalking. You can't wake up somebody who's pretending to be asleep. You see the point?
Add to that, Muhammad actually said two things when he witnessed the test Trinity. First, he recalled two verses from the Gita. The one was, my splendor is like that of the radiance of 1,000 suns burst upon the sky. But he also recalled the matching verse, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. Now, of course, as a Hindu, I find that interesting because the test was called Trinity. What is the Trinity in Hinduism? Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, creator, preserver, and destroyer. So there is that duality there. And okay, you can't unlearn the knowledge gained. But what have we done with biological weapons? What have we done with landmines? What have we done with cluster munitions? What have we done with the chemical weapons? You can control, regulate, outlaw, prohibit, and put in place verification machinery to guard against cheating and detection and breakout so that everyone has confidence in the system existing without detection and cheating. Until you get that system, you're not going to get others to sign on to it. But that is what we should be working on instead of engaging in debates about, well, you can't unlearn it. No, no one is saying you can unlearn it, but it can be controlled.
Yes, please.
I would like to use Chemical Weapon Convention as an example. Under the Chemical Weapon Convention, the idea is not to remove the knowledge about chemical weapons. The idea is to make countries very difficult to produce and to deploy operational chemical weapons because the treaty includes monetary system everywhere in the whole world. I believe that if we have a nuclear ban treaty, the idea is the same. We cannot remove the knowledge about nuclear weapons, but under the system, under the treaty, we will develop a monitoring system. It will be very, very difficult for countries to deploy operational nuclear weapons under the system. So that's my thought.
The next question, yes, sir, you were at the back.
Hi, I'm Heshagadi Gavatur. Just a question to Professor Thakur. You mentioned that the solution, or one of the solutions to the entire crisis could be the establishment of a rule-based order. But one thing that came to my mind was that in the current system, it is the very fact that a rule-based order exists that is preventing us, because you have the N5 and the P5, in kind of taking some form of some steps to eradicate nuclear weapons. So could it be possible that there is some other solution rather than a rule-based order, in the sense of more of a deal-based order? Why I say that is, so we are considering nuclear weapons for nuclear weapons, but with the rise of China and with the rise of globalization, could it be possible that nuclear weapons or the carrot to eradicate nuclear weapons could be more economic or trade-based arguments? I don't know if I'm making sense, but what I'm saying is, rather than exchange nuclear weapons or kind of reduce nuclear weapons for nuclear weapons, the answer could be something with regard to trade, where the rise of China as a dominant state doesn't have too many nuclear weapons, but they have the economic power. So could that be an argument to kind of pressure the global powers, the US and Russia, to kind of step down their nuclear capabilities?
I'll answer your question first and then take up the comment with which you began in more detail. The answer is yes, because you can make the point very easily. Look at South Korea, look at North Korea. Which do you think has higher status, is more influential, is more respected member of the international community? It is the economic success that is important, not the possession of nuclear weapons. And you can extend that to Europe as well. with young people, that seems to be a favorite reference point of discussions today. I asked them, which country of these following three do you think is the most influential in Europe? Germany, France, and the UK. Everyone says Germany. Then I asked them, which of the three do you think is the only one without nuclear weapons? They are all astonished when I say it's Germany. So yes, you can make that argument and extend it by saying nuclear weapons have never proven to be a cost-effective form of national defense. It does not allow you to short circuit on conventional defense. It adds to all the costs, plus the costs of infrastructure, safety issues, security issues, guarding against theft, the whole lot. So yes, that argument is there. But the first part of your question is more interesting, I think, to me at least. And that is the rules-based order. Rules can be broken down into rule making, rule interpretation, and rule enforcement. Rule making in the UN system is not the Security Council, it's the General Assembly. That is the normative center of gravity. Rule enforcement is the Security Council, the geopolitical center of gravity. And rule interpretation goes back to the International Court of Justice. And what has happened recently with the democratization of foreign policy and international politics, suddenly the General Assembly is starting to assert itself. Let me give you three examples. For the first time in the selection of the new Secretary General, the General Assembly inserted itself into the process. And the consensus amongst UN watchers is, had this process been followed 10 years ago, it is extremely unlikely that Ban Ki-moon would have been the final choice, because the General Assembly had a say. Equally, if the General Assembly had not inserted itself into the process, it's extremely unlikely that Antonio Guterres would have emerged the winner this time around. One example. Second example, the World Court keeps coming back. The final vacancy for the World Court position judges this year, or last year, I mean, this year, last year, very recently anyway, late last year, to the end of last year, ended up unexpectedly a contest for renomination of a British judge and an Indian judge. No P5 member previously has failed to have a judge of its nationality elected to the World Court. In the Security Council, the election procedure is equal voting and open voting without a veto in the Security Council and the General Assembly. In the Security Council, the British judge had, I think, 9 of the 15 votes, and the Indian judge had less than a majority. And they need a majority in both houses. But in the General Assembly, the Indian judge had a near 2/3 majority, and the British judge had a small number of supporters. And the Indian campaign then turned that into a fight between the General Assembly, where everyone is equal, and the Security Council, where the P5 are privileged. And the Indian judge prevailed, and when that became clear, the British judge withdrew. Third example, the ban treaty. It would never have been approved in the Security Council. But in the General Assembly, 122 states voted for it, rejecting all the attempts to delegitimize, to undermine, to defeat the conference being held and the ban. So suddenly we are seeing the General Assembly taking on the function of being the rule-making body for the international community. And therefore, when you say the rules-based order is not possible to change because of the Security Council, that is simply not true. The normative center of gravity is the General Assembly. It is time it started acting in a more cohesive and united manner to take on that responsibility, not the least because of the structural flaws of the Security Council.
Thank you, Ramesh. I must regretfully conclude question time. According to the organizers, each panelist has 2 minutes for a concluding statement. Would you like to begin, Pali?
Well, it was quite a illuminating exchange. I think the last point made by Ramesh I totally agree with, in the sense that United Nations, despite all its drawbacks, has been trying to reassert, and these are good examples. And I think it's up to the overwhelming majority of the countries who are not represented in the Security Council to keep repeating that exercise.
Mr. Dibin.
Thank you. I like to respond to the ideas of the young gentleman. I believe that you raised a very important point, and I will bring your idea back to my country and tell my government not to overreact to the U.S. nuclear post review. I will tell them that nuclear weapons are paper tigers. Thank you.
Claudia.
I'll quickly respond to one of the questions that was asked in the beginning about the role of civil society and why we are not seeing mass mobilizations. I think in case of Pakistan, and generally probably South Asia, in the public imagination, nuclear threat appears to be very abstract given the fact that there are so many challenges that people are confronted with on daily basis, and life itself is so uncertain. So so what it means is that we have to take every state in its own particular stride, and we have to, when we try to understand nuclear trends and nuclear politics, we need to look very carefully into how different societies have different kind of problems and why they behave the way they behave. Thank you.
Rakesh, you have the last word.
Thank you, sir. I think what we need to understand is that we are living in a very different kind of a world today. And I come back to saying, the existing arms control, it didn't delegitimize nuclear weapons per se, it delegitimized nuclear proliferation. That's the NPT. If you look at the US-Soviet arms control, it in a manner sort of highlighted the relevance of deterrence. It didn't again delegitimize nuclear weapons. So if we have to start thinking in a different mode, then we have to start thinking differently. We have to start looking at delegitimization. And again, as Ramesh said, and you can't put the genie back, but you can use the human ingenuity and the human mind collectively to develop rules and international agreements of the kind that we have developed to deal with other weapons of mass destruction. So just as we delegitimize those weapons, thereby preparing the ground for these negotiations, that's what we need to do. But for that, most important is, just as we have been fortunate, either we can count on our good fortune or start dealing with that particular challenge today, because the risks today are greater than they were in the past.
Let's show our appreciation to the panelists. Nesha, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Ambassador Dhanapala, for so ably moderating this set of presentations. I know the time is up, so I'm very briefly going to summarize perhaps just 6 points that were made. The first being that we are at a time of very significant risks now. All of the presenters made that point. Secondly, that the complete elimination of these risks will require total disarmament. But, however, that procession towards total disarmament will not take place in a linear fashion. That was a point made that even if the number of weapons decrease, risk can increase. Thirdly, that there is a critical role for the public and for civil society in finding innovative methods of communication and advocacy. And the point made about Professor Thakur made about the power of collective revulsion is important. Fourthly, One reason that it needs to find innovative methods is because the nature of the threat has changed due to modern technologies, including in particular cybersecurity threats. However, at the same time, that we must look for that innovation, perhaps not just in this era, but in the pre-nuclear era, as was mentioned, looking at perhaps in the pre-World War I era for some learning experiences of how to manage current tensions and risks. Fifthly, the point was made about the key role of China and India, who perhaps all need to understand that nuclear weapons may not actually be as useful as they think for their strategic objectives. And finally, of the need to keep supporting this critical ban treaty and not to fall prey. I think the point was made very ably of not to fall prey to people who deride this as idealism. So that was just 6 points that came to me, but so much more was said, and I really thank all the presenters for such fascinating and valuable insights. It remains for me to thank everyone who has contributed to making this event a success. Professor Thakur, our moderator, Mr. Dhanapala, our expert panelists, Ms. Tasleem, Dr. Lee Bin, Mr. Sood, Mr. Palihakara. I wish to thank also the other members of the APLN today, and including Dr. Hong and Mr. John Tyleman for initiating this event with LKI, and to the members of the Board of Management for their support, including Professor Melaguda for her introductory remarks today. Thank you also to officers of the Foreign Ministry for always their support, to my colleagues at LKI, and to Jamie Cho of APLN for her hard work and their hard work in preparing for this event. Thank you all for being here to participate, both old friends and new friends of LKI. And that concludes this evening's proceedings. And I would like to invite you to join us outside for refreshments. Thank you very much.